Well, hey there, makers. Happy Wednesday. April Dunnam here. In this video, I'm going to try to demystify this thing called JSON or JSON. I'll explain what it is, how you use it, where you use it, and I'll show a few specific examples for my Power Platform and M365 people out there. All that coming up right after this. So what exactly is this thing? I kind of made a joke about it at the beginning, but there are two ways to pronounce this. So if you hear either of these ways, know that people are talking about the same thing. So some people pronounce this JSON, and other people pronounce it JSON. Whichever one strikes your fancy, it's all the same thing. JSON is actually an abbreviation for JavaScript Object Notation. But don't let that fool you. This is language independent. This isn't JavaScript or anything really particularly developer-y or codey. So what exactly is this JSON used for? Well, it's commonly used to pass data from a client to a server. So it could be a web application you have, or if you're a Power Platform person like myself, you might have a custom connector that connects to a particular API and service. So you can use JSON to pass data back and forth between that. We use JSON in Power Apps often to pass data to Power Automate, but another big use case is just for storing, configuring, and verifying data. You might have heard of something called XML, which is another data format that was used quite a bit. The reason, though, that JSON has become more popular over, say, XML is that it's more readable and user-friendly and less bloated. When you look at a JSON file, it's intuitive and pretty simple to read and understand what's going on, which is why it's commonly used to store data and configuration information. So in a web app, you might have your config settings. JSON is commonly used for that. If we look at SharePoint list formatting, JSON's used to hold the configuration information for how your list should be displayed with the formatting. If we look at adaptive cards that are commonly used in Power Automate and to post messages to teams, that is all using JSON to store the configuration data. So how does this JSON stuff actually work? When you break it down, all it really is a name-value pairs. What I mean by that, if you take a look at this example, say we want to store someone's first name and their last name. We would have the value that we're wanting to track, like first name, here in quotes. Then we'll put in a colon and we'll pass in the value for that named object, in this case, first name. So we have our named object, first name in quotes, colon, then we pass the value to associate that with, also in quotes, so April. And then we separate out our objects with commas. So I want to track and store both the first and last name. So after I have my first name value pairs defined, I'll do a comma and then do the same thing for last name. So in quotes, I'll have last name, colon, in quotes, Dunnam, my value. We can take this a step farther and integrate arrays, which you would wrap in square brackets in your JSON. For those of you not familiar, think of an array just as tabular data. So rather than just having one record like first and last name, maybe instead we wanted to store a bunch of records for our staff. So there might be multiple people. That is an array. So in this JSON example, we're defining an array called staff. So we put the array name of staff in quotes, colon, then we have an open square bracket. Then we'll pass in the individual values or first names and last names of the staff members. Same as what we did before. So we'll have a squiggly bracket with our name value pairs of first name, colon John, comma to separate out our values in there, last name, colon Doe. We're also using the commas in this instance to separate out our groups of name value pairs. So we have one name value pair here storing the first and last name for John Doe. We'll have a comma to store the other name value pair of the first and last name for April Dunnam, and so on and so forth. Then we need to close our array out with a closing square bracket. All that is wrapped in a open squiggly and closed squiggly bracket to format the JSON. Now that you have the basics, Next thing you need to know is, what do you use to write JSON? There are all kinds of tools out there, but my preferred tool is Visual Studio Code. Just search for VS Code in your search engine of choice and you'll find the link to download. Cool thing about it as well is it works both on Windows and Mac. So I'm going to open up VS Code and show you how you can create new JSON files in it. So if you want to create one from scratch, we'll go to File, New File, and we want to tell it that this is a JSON file so that it gives us some built-in IntelliSense to help us write our JSON file. So what we'll do after we click that is go to File again, do a Save As, and here we can change the Save As type, and you can see all of the different file types that we can create, one of them being JSON. So we'll select that option there, give it a name, click Save, and it instantly changes the file and optimizes it for writing JSON. But what did we just learn about JSON? We start our JSON with an open squiggly bracket. Now we just have to tell it the name value pairs of the data we want to pass. Maybe I want to pass some information about application names. So I might have a named object called app name. Then I need to define the value for that. So we'll do a colon, and then in quotes, I'll put in the app name. So that right there is a simple and perfectly acceptable example of a JSON file. I'm going to show you something in VS Code that will make your life easier though, if you're just starting out creating JSON and figuring out how to write it. There's an extension that you can download that will validate your JSON for you and automatically fix things. So in VS Code, on this little left rail here, we'll see this box looking icon. If we hover over it, it says extensions. So we'll click on that and just do a search in this extension marketplace for JSON. As you can see, there's no shortage of extensions that we have at our disposal to help us with writing JSON. One that I particularly like is this Fix JSON extension. So if you want to use it, you'll just click on it and select Install. But I'm going to show you what this will do for you. So say that you forgot to wrap your name value in quotes. Well, first, Visual Studio Code alone is going to highlight that as an issue. It's going to let you know that properties must be double quoted. But if we use that extension, we can have it fix it for us. So what I'll do in this file is I'll right click and I'll open up what's called the command palette, and we'll type fix, and then fix JSON will pop up. So we'll just click that. And you see, as soon as I clicked it, it identified this was the JSON file. It found what was wrong and fixed it for me. That is pretty sweet. So as you start getting more comfortable with it and building longer, more complex pieces of JSON, that will really come in handy. So expanding on this JSON example, if I also wanted to track for these applications, the app name and say the app owner, we can do that. We can add another property to this by separating that out with a comma and defining another named value. So we'll do app owner, colon, and then the value for that. Right now, this is just a single record of information that we have in this JSON file. But remember, we can do those things called arrays to have multiple different rows of data for our JSON file. So if we wanted to turn this into an array, we could come up here before these open squigglies, and we can define a name for the array. So I might have an array called apps. For arrays, we need to wrap those in a square bracket. So we'll do a colon after that, square bracket. And I'll close that out there. In all of our, so right now we have an issue. So it looks like it's giving us an error in VS Code. So I'll go back to my command palette. We'll do a fix JSON again. And we'll see what that just did. So what the error was is our JSON files have to start and end with a squiggly bracket. So that's what our fix JSON just did for us. It added that in so that we have valid JSON now. So we have an array called apps with a single item in it. If we need to add another application to this array, we can do a comma after this squiggly bracket record, another squiggly bracket, and just repeat the same name value pair structure. Now let's go into some use cases. We see how we can use VS Code and some nifty extensions to help us write JSON, but how can we actually start using this in applications? One of the easiest ways and ways that I love of using JSON is with SharePoint list formatting. In case you haven't caught my videos about this, SharePoint list formatting is a way that we can use JSON to change the look and feel of our SharePoint list. So take this list here, which I've used the Microsoft List Asset Manager template for. This is using SharePoint list formatting. So if we look at the status and the manufacturer fields, we'll see that they have some color coding associated to it. That's done with something called column formatting. So if we click on this status dropdown and go to column settings and format this column and switch to advanced mode, look what we have there. What does that look like to you? If you guessed JSON, you guessed right. This allows us to use JSON to change the styling of a SharePoint list. Let's take a look at a JSON example to format this list. So I already have a JSON file created, so let's open this up. So I'll right click and go to Open with Code to open Visual Studio Code. And we'll see this particular JSON sample is about 19 lines of JSON. So starting off, like we said, everything wrapped in those squirrely brackets. And then we just have our name value pairs. We have one named value called schema, and we're passing in this instance, a value of a URL for the SharePoint list formatting schema reference. We have another name value pair called element type or ELM type, and we're passing in a value of div. So in this instance, we're going to transform that SharePoint column, contents within it, and put that into a div, which in HTML terms is kind of like a container. Then you'll see what we have next. What were those things we talked about that can let us store multiple items of information, arrays? That's what we have here with this children property. It's an array called children, and in it we have two different objects. We have another name value pair called element type, and we're giving that a value of span. Within this same object, we have another name value pair called attributes that we're passing in some values of class, which has information in it, and icon name, which contains another value that has some if statements in it. And within this particular object, we also have one more name value pair called style that has a sub-property called padding left with that value applied. And then we've got one more object with element type of span and text content with after. You'll see what this is actually doing once we use this sample. So what I'm going to do is copy this JSON, and this is about to make much more sense. So in our list here, if I scroll over, for each of these items we have a number field, one for before and one for after. So with this sample, what I'm trying to do is see if this after value is greater than or less than the before value. That's what that formatting sample we just looked at is doing. So to apply this, if I go to my after field and click the drop down and go to column settings and format this column, and we'll go to advanced mode, we will replace what's in there with what we copied from that sample in VSCode, and then click save. You'll see what happened here when I did that. An icon was added to our list. So in this case, 50 is less than 100, the before value, so we have an icon pointing down. In the second item though, 100 is more than 25, which was the before value, so we have an icon pointing up. That simple piece of JSON that we copied over did all of that. We're really just using JSON in this example to pass in and format HTML and CSS that styles the list. That's why we have a name value pair called element type. So for this HTML, we'll have a div, and within that div, we'll have two spans. Within this first span, we want to show that icon. We're doing that with this icon named value pair. So we're actually able to put in some expressions in here so we can say if the after value is greater than before, then show an icon named sort up. But if the after value is less than the before value, show an icon called sort down. That is an example of how we can use that to format a particular column, but we can also use this same concept of list formatting and JSON helping us do that to change the look of an entire view of how we're seeing this, or even the form that we're seeing when we click new on a SharePoint list. So it can be used in all those areas thanks to JSON. And if you're interested in learning about SharePoint formatting a little bit more, I do have some videos on my channel that you can check out, and also be sure to check out the PnP repo, that's SharePoint Patterns and Practices repository, where they have all kinds of different samples, which are just JSON files, that you can use to format your Microsoft/SharePoint list for your columns, your list views, and your forms. And of course, I'll put a link to this in the video notes. I wanted to show you one more use case of JSON, and that's with something called adaptive cards. So if you've ever used the approvals that are in Power Automate, then you've actually used adaptive cards. The approvals that we get sent to an email that kind of looks like this. We get an approve and a reject button that are interactive in the email. So I can click one of these buttons, and when I click it, you see a pop-up shows where I can actually put in some additional information like comments and press submit. So this interaction is all done with adaptive cards. These adaptive cards are also commonly used in Teams as well. So in this case, I'm using the Flowbot to post an adaptive card message to my Teams channel. And how do these adaptive cards work? How do you format them? With JSON. And this leads me to another tool that I want to show you that's going to make your life easier when building adaptive cards. If you go to adaptivecards.io, we have this great tool called the Adaptive Card Designer. If we look at what's going on here, we have this sample card that has some information and a few interactive buttons. The Adaptive Card Designer is actually showing you the outputted JSON that you need to get something that looks like this. This is really going to save you time. You don't have to write all of this JSON from scratch. You can use this interactive tool. It will produce the JSON for you, and all you have to do is copy and paste that into Power Automate or wherever you are using the adaptive card in. With these adaptive cards in the designer, we can have things like column sets. All you have to do is click on the element here from the left-hand side, click, hold, and drag and drop. So if you wanted to have multi-column information in here, you add the column set and then click this little button on the bottom right-hand side, and that adds a column into the column set. So if I wanted to show information like first name and then to the right, show the value, we can do that with the two columns. So right now I just have two empty columns, but I can drag and drop in one of these text blocks. I can just type in there and replace the text. So I can type first name, and I can drag and drop another text box into that other column and type April. And all of that is updating below this card payload editor, which is the outputted JSON file. So if we want to use this JSON that the Adaptive Card Designer just produced for us, we can click the Copy Card Payload, and we'll jump back over to VS Code, create a new file, and we'll paste that in so we can kind of see what's going on. As you can see with adaptive cards, your JSON can get pretty wild. This particular one's 138 lines, but it's really all the same. We have a name value called type, and we're telling it that this is an adaptive card. Then we have another array. So we have an array called body with all of these properties in it. And what you're seeing with this is that we can nest things. So this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated. So I have an array called body in this JSON. And then down here, you'll see that we have another array called columns. So we can have array nested with array, nested with array. So let's take a look at how would we use this, say, in a situation with Power Automate. Well, we'll copy this JSON that was produced for us. We'll open up Power Automate, go to My Flows. We'll create a brand new flow just to test this out. What I'm going to do is I'll just do an instant flow so that we can trigger it directly from here. So I'll do a manual one, and I'll just call this Adaptive Card Test. So really simple. I just want to click a button and have it go post an adaptive card to Teams. So I'll select New Step, and we'll just do a search for adaptive card. So one of the options here that we have is to post an adaptive card as the Flowbot to a user directly in Teams. So I'll select this option so we can see how this works. So we need to put who the recipient is. So I'll select myself for this case. We'll do a headline of testing adaptive cards. And in the message, that's where you'll paste your JSON. So I'll just do a Control V to paste that in. There's all that long goodness. And right now, this is all kind of just static, hard-coded text. But within Power Automate, we have dynamic content, so we can pull in data from our trigger or other actions in here. So I could look at this JSON, and maybe I'll find that section that we added where we had our first name, and then I manually put in April. So here we go. So there's the text first name, and then there's text April. So we can use dynamic content. I can remove April, which is what I manually typed, and scroll down and look at our dynamic content window. And I could pull in, say, the username from this trigger. So now that property is mapped there. Now let's test this out. That's really all we need to do. So I'm going to save this, click test. Okay, moment of truth, it's running. We got some green check marks in Power Automate, which is always great to see. Now let's jump over to Teams, see if it worked. Awesome, there is our nice new fancy adaptive card in Teams. And you'll see on the first name that we added, it did pull in my name because I'm the one that executed this flow. All right, well, that's about all that I have for you today. I hope that I gave you a good introduction to JSON and the tools and resources that you need to get started. If you did find this helpful, please like, subscribe, share with your friends, and I'll catch you in the next video.